The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome. Today we explore the role of neuropsychological studies in intelligence education, the next installment in Henley-Putnam University's free webinar series. My name is Lauren Harrison and I'm the marketing manager here at Henley-Putnam. We have a number of participants joining us today, so we'll wait about a minute before we get started. We'll be back on the line then. Thanks. Hello and welcome to the latest in the Henley-Putnam University webinar series. Today we join Dr. Harry Nyman to explore the role of neuropsychological studies in intelligence education, the next installment in Henley-Putnam University's free webinar series. Dr. Nyman has over 30 years' experience as a military intelligence officer, systems and operations research analyst, process engineer, consultant, and project manager of both industry and government positions. He received his doctorate from the University of Phoenix in 2008 with a dissertation of expectation violence theory for virtual teams and its effect on decision-making in a military environment. Currently, he is working as a senior ORSA analyst for the Boeing Corporation in a major project for the U.S. Army. Before we start the webinar, I'd like to tell you a little bit about us. Henley-Putnam University is a leading educational institution specializing in the field of strategic security. Our focus is on intelligence management, terrorism and counterterrorism studies, and strategic security and protection management. Our faculty is chosen for the depth and breadth of their actual practical experience in the field. The university offers accredited online Bachelor and Master of Science degrees in intelligence management, terrorism and counterterrorism studies, and strategic security and protection management. We offer a doctorate in strategic security and also several certificate programs. The university is nationally accredited by the Distance Education and Training Council. We are also approved to train veterans and have experienced student enrollment professionals to assist you. You can complete your course of study 100% online. Classes start as soon as June, so learn more about us today by visiting us on the web at www.henley-putnam.edu. I'm going to turn this over to Harrison from our marketing team. He has some logistical information to go over before we get started. Thank you for joining us, and I hope you enjoyed today's webinar. Go ahead, Harrison.
Thanks, Lauren, and thank you to everyone joining us on the line today. We have quite a few attendees, so we're excited to have you. I just want to share a few reminders with the audience before we kickstart the webinar. First, your lines are on mute, and we just do that to reduce the background noise since we do have quite a few attendees. But we do encourage and want your participation. So if you have any questions, please just use the questions widget on the right side of your GoToWebinar control panel and chat those over to me, and we will revisit those at the question and answer period at the end of today's webinar. Second, we are recording the webinar today, so you will be able to access the audio and video from the webinar on the Henley-Putnam website in the security briefings section under the Student Resources tab from the home page. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Nyman, and we look forward to revisiting and engaging with you all during the question and answer period at the end of the webinar. Doctor, go ahead.
Thank you very much. As stated, please hold your questions until the end, and I'll be happy to answer them as I can. And this is our agenda today. What we're going to do is take a look at the definitions and aspects of cognition, tie that into the intelligence continuum and how security and analysis is currently being done, then take a look at cognitive bias and intelligence analysis and what is going on there and why it needs to be addressed. Finally, we'll take a look at the incorporation of neuropsychology as a factor in intelligence education. And this is just a preliminary examination because the depth of what it is that this entails is just too broad to go into in this short period of time. And then finally, we will go into some various conclusions on how we could address this and answer some questions. First, let's establish some definitions. As with anything, you have to have a common frame of reference, so let's first discuss the definition of bias. There are 3 points of view here that you can see. I'll give you a second to read those. Bias is basically any preconceived notions or ideas that we have that will color the way that we do analysis or the way that we draw conclusions. Many times those biases are not even understood by us. We don't really recognize that they exist because they are so deeply ingrained into our own personalities and into the cultures within which we establish ourselves or in which we operate. Because of that, we need to have a better understanding of the processes that we use within the domains of cognition and in decision-making and full analysis. This comes from the study of heuristics. And I will read this. A heuristic is a mental shortcut that allows people to solve problems, make judgments quickly and efficiently. The problem with heuristics is that as we generate them throughout our lives, and they start almost from the day that we're born, they become very ingrained into our brains and into our psyches, as I mentioned, and in some studies are considered to be the basis for biases. Now, cognition itself, the basis of cognition, as it says here, is theory, not fact. The reason for that is we really do not know how the brain works in terms of how a new idea is formed. Through various tools that we have out in the scientific community, we can watch as certain stimuli are presented to the brain and which portions of the brain actually initiate or become hot on the screen. All this means is that that portion of the brain is, in fact, receiving more blood because it is pulling in more functional activity. It does not give us a good understanding of what is actually happening down at the neuron or the subneuron levels. We've currently identified two types of cognition. First is conscious thought. Those thoughts, those ideas that we form, that we consider in the foreground and actually spend time deciding what it is that we have or what we're doing. Studies now show that that is roughly 10 to 15% of the amount of thought that we perform. Unconscious thought goes on in the background. We are not aware of it. About the only time we have any understanding or any connection with that is when we are asleep and we dream. And again, roughly 85 to 90% of all neurological activity occurs in this domain. Some studies also show that we have already decided subconsciously what actions we are going to take long before we have even considered that a problem even exists. Now here you also see that I say that cognition may not be localized. Localization is a structure that says that it is happening or something is happening in direct connection to something else. In physics, localization means that you are within a specific domain that is linked by some type of medium. For example, when you're talking from one person to another, the medium is air, and you are localized in such a way that the contact from your mouth into the air to carry the vocal waves, the sound waves that are being transmitted to the other person's ear, are all connected. They are all localized. Excuse me. Many studies are showing now that the act of cognition may actually indicate a separation between what we know as the brain and what we know as the mind. This is only hypothesis at this point. Some individuals within the study of neuroplasticity and subatomic physics are actually considering that the location or the function of the mind actually extends beyond our bodies and may actually connect us to the gestalt mind of the universe. Now, again, this is hypothesis. This is not even theory at this point. but there are some indications, particularly at the quantum physics level, that that may in fact be true. And the fourth factor there is bias is usually externally set and controlled. And by that I mean that our biases are initially established by the physical nature of what is around us, where we live, where we were brought up, the dynamics of the culture, the religion, the community, how we have been trained as we go through schools, how we are trained with peers, and then finally how we actually involve ourselves into the overall society in general. There is a genetic factor to that that is being investigated. In fact, I'm working fairly closely with Dr. Gloria Fawcett, who is a genetic engineer and researcher at Baylor Medical Center here in Houston, Texas, in discussing and determining whether or not the aspect of cognition and the aspects of how our personalities are formed have a genetic factor, and if so, what that genetic factor is, beyond the fact that our parents and our parents' parents survived in the culture and therefore lived long enough to pass on their specific structures to us. Now, let's take a look at a quick little visual experiment. This experiment is a way of showing bias. Now, as I start this, you'll see the triangle on the side moving towards the square. As it moves forward, you can predict that it will continue to move in that direction going up to the square. Now, it goes to the square and will continue moving, but what is that movement that it's going to continue as? Think about that for a second. Now, here's the actual movement that it is attaining. What happened? Why did it bounce in that way? The reason is behind the square there was a pillar or a barrier of some kind that the triangle bumped up against and then caromed off of it. Our bias, when we're looking at this without knowing that the dot exists back there, would say that it would continue underneath the square and continue out the other side in the same direction. And it's because we did not know what was behind there, therefore we expected that it would continue in a single direction. Therefore, we have to be able to consider that there are more than one possible progression in a situation like this. But our bias says that this is the only possible progression because of what we see. I have another experiment that I give in classes that entails drawing 3 diamonds and 3 rectangles. The individuals will then draw a line, one single line from each diamond to each rectangle, and they have to conclude it by making sure that there is one line from each one to the other without touching any other line or crossing it. When you do that on a 2-dimensional sheet of paper, it is impossible. You cannot do it. You will always reach a point where one line has to cross another. And at that point, 94% of the students that I've given it to will stop. They don't know what to do beyond that. Every so often you have a student that will punch a hole in the paper, draw the line on the other side, punch another hole when he is beyond where the line barrier is, and then continue the line continuing on to the end point, thus connecting all of the symbols on the paper. The bias that is shown there is that you told them to draw it on the paper, and we expect that the only thing that we can do is look at the one side of the paper, that we cannot use a 3-dimensional structure by poking a hole through the paper. Now, we get many examples of this from many sources, this intelligence continuum that we're showing here. You'll notice that in this we show an active collaboration that continuously rotates along a predictive path. However, this cognition structure in reality may be better associated with what this paper is labeling the intelligence continuum. And here you see that there is no one directional structure. It is multidirectional, and it includes all of the associated systems of neurological processes, cybernetic processes, and cultural aspects in order to be complete. Most intelligence organizations, in fact, most places that do any type of analysis, will tend to ignore these factors. And yet these factors are what drive the decision-making of the people that may be our targets. The current state of intelligence and security education began in the early 1900s. During the Cold War, we invested huge resources in the training and education of experts who would understand various regions and cultures in a deep and intimate way. However, those days are over. Those investments are no longer being made, and reports of the ignorance of our student body concerning what used to be called civics betray an appalling situation and a national failure in my mind. American academia, which increasingly takes refuge in the study of transhistorical, transcultural theory, is not turning out specialists in area studies, which are denigrated by the new mandate devoted to such actual and historic, or I should say acultural and ahistoric studies. Since career incentives for area studies are being closed down, students do not enter these fields, and the vicious cycle repeats itself of applying American or Western cultural values to other cultural decision-making and structures. Case studies of intelligence failure abound, as shown by R.K. Betts in his book, Enemies of Intelligence. Yet scholars lament the lack of the theory of intelligence, negative or descriptive theory. The empirical understanding of how intelligence systems make mistakes is well developed. The distinction is significant because there is little evidence that either scholars or practitioners have succeeded in translating such knowledge into reforms that measurably reduce failure. The primary failure in correcting this failure of intelligence may lie, and this is supported by many authors and scholars, in the paradoxes of perception, and it's time to change that perception. There is a tendency for individual psychology to be culturally biased. This means ignoring the differences between cultures and imposing understanding based on the study of one culture to other cultures. And there are several different types of this kind of bias. One is called ethnocentrism, which is the belief that one's own cultural group is superior, that one's own cultural beliefs are normal and others are abnormal. Excentrism emphasizes theories and ideas within a specific area, country, or religion, as the X supplies the basis for that. The X could be Chinese, it could be Iranian, it could be Islam, it could be Christianity, or whatever. The research analysis is applied to other cultures to create a supposedly universal view of human behavior, which uses that X structure as the baseline. It is that point of deviation, thereby creating an unconscious bias for that particular deviant point as the baseline. Research and analysis can be culturally biased in several ways. The first is cultural bias. What is cultural bias? Cultural bias is taking the structure of what it is that we understand as being that which everything else derives from. Basically, we are what we think we are. Secondly, we think from what we have learned. We do not establish a situation based on the merits of what is being shown. Rather, we apply it subconsciously to that which we have experienced in the past and use that as the basis or model or skeleton of what it is that we are going to develop as our conclusions. And finally, we have learned 80% of what we know in our first 4 years of life. So you can see that when you associate that with the subconscious aspect and the fact that there is very little that we remember consciously from those first 4 years of life, we therefore unconsciously supply a vast majority of the data or the analytical tool structure that we have based on anything that we had developed in our first 4 years. That's unacceptable. Now, as we already discussed, and I got a little ahead of myself, cultural bias is that tendency for individual psychology to be based on our culture. We ignore the differences between other cultures and impose our understanding based on the study of one to the other, and we already discussed the various forms. Research and analysis can be biased culturally in several ways. We bias the questions that we ask, and we may only concern issues that are relevant to one culture. This is something that is very evident if you follow any kind of news media today. The news media, the people that are in those fields generally, not always, but generally are journalists. They are trained to be journalists. Yet they are reporting on business, they are reporting on politics, they are reporting on the military, they are reporting on science, without an understanding of those particular fields. And without that understanding, how can they generate the appropriate questions to ask to get to the information that they are seeking? And how are they going to know that the information that they are being provided is in fact accurate? The sources used may use an unrepresentative sample in terms of those cultural groups or subcultural groups. A very good example is the aspect of terrorism and terrorist bombings. There is a tendency for some groups, some people, to state that because terrorists come from a specific religion, that that religion in itself is terrorism or terrorist-based, which is totally and completely false. Terrorists can come from any number of society backgrounds and for any number of reasons. An example of that is the Thuggee culture that existed during the Raj, the British Raj in India. Those individuals worshipped a goddess by the name of Kali, who required her followers to create chaos through murder of individuals. And that's what they did. To the victims, they were terrorists. To themselves and to their goddess, they were just following the laws, the culture, the structure of what they knew to be religiously right. Another example is how various Native American groups in the American West would torture captives. The American soldiers, the American people saw that as a horrible situation where in the minds of those particular tribes, they were actually giving the captive a compliment in a sense, in that they considered them very strong and they wanted that strength to enter into themselves and could only do that through the torture of the individual. Ridiculous in our ideas, but yet that's how they believed. We bias based on the ideology that we used. It may be unfamiliar to certain cultural groups. That particular structure of what it is that we think may have no representation in other cultures. and the culture of the investigator, which is similar to the ideology used. If an investigator from one cultural group studies another, they often do misinterpret the other group's behavior and the answers that are provided. Obviously, the environment that they carry out the investigation or the analysis plays a great role, particularly in high-stress conditions. It is known that under high stress that heart rate increases. When heart rate increases above 145 beats per minute based on stress, the brain begins to shut down. The higher functions of cognition within the brain shut down. At 155 beats per minute, they are totally turned off. And the only thing that you have functioning in your brain at that point is the medulla oblongata, or the animal portion of the brain, which is your fight or flight reflective actions. You are not, at that point, thinking. And finally, the way that the findings are used. Psychology is considered a science. Finding conclusions can be thought of as facts and can be used to hide prejudice and bias. Psychology is not really a science. Psychology is an art, and it is because we know so very, very little of how the brain itself works, or the relationships between the brain and the mind. Let's do another little experiment. Read this, and then think in your own mind, what did Mao really mean by saying, "I am only a lone monk walking in the world with a leaky umbrella"? Now, having thought about that for a minute, let me give you a little more information. First, this is a Chinese couplet. The second part, translated literally, means without hair, without sky. More confusing, isn't it? Yet when we add the culture of the area that Mao was from, what that without hair and without eye means in their culture was without law and without heaven. Colloquially, from his region, this means that he is defying laws, both human and divine. The actual translation that was applied to this by Kissinger and his cultural experts at the time was that Mao was telling Henry Kissinger, when they were trying to arrange a visit between Chairman Mao and President Nixon, and Mao had said that he would never accept, that it was unlawful for him to accept foreign visitors such as President Nixon. Mao was telling Kissinger that he would not be bound by any laws that were made, not even the laws of his own ideology, and was in fact making this statement to warn his own people to get out of his way, that he was going to do this because it was the thing that needed to be done. Quite a bit different from what the original statement stated. Now let's talk a little bit about the incorporation of neuropsychology into intelligence education. Most of us are aware of the Sun Tzu philosophy of knowing oneself and one's enemies. Yet, how many of us fully know ourselves? We have psychological and cultural closets within which we hide, yet constantly referred to through various preconceived notions and beliefs set by our rearing, our education, culture, and genetics. If we have never done a psychological profile on ourselves, we cannot truthfully state that we know ourselves. As stated earlier, many of us believe we know what cognition is. We often define it as thinking. Yet what is the definition of thinking? Would you believe that, according to the dictionary, it is the process of cognition? Yet if you look up the definition of cognition, it is thinking. So what we have is a definition that is circular and invalid. So let's use the definitions that we have here. Cognition is loosely defined, as I said, of thinking. So let's ask, what is the process of forming a thought? Is it chemical? Is it electrochemical, biological, or something else? Right now, there are no experimental facts on what a thought is or the process of forming a thought or an idea, particularly a new one. So let's take a quick look at the human neuron. There are many things about the neurons that we used to think were true that we are now finding out that are totally false. For example, at one time it was generally believed, and I was taught when I was a young man in grade school and high school, that a neuron was a single-celled item that was of microscopic size. We now know that there are single-celled neurons that can grow to be as long as 15 feet and 5 millimeters in diameter, a single cell. A neuron is composed of a nucleus, the membrane, axion, and synapses. As it says here, the synapses are the feelers of the neuron body, but they never touch. There is a gap between the two that is shown in the call-out picture. At the end, each synapse in the vesicule, they release a chemical soup that is received by receptors on a neighboring synapse. The best we can tell, this is similar to a computer operating not in binary mode, but rather at least hexadecimal mode. So instead of simple on-off switches, what you have is the possibility of a base 16 structure, or possibly as much as a base 64 structure. The chemical soup is received by specific channels. Those channels will take in those chemicals that are released in a certain quantity of a certain type. And it is the quantity and type of chemical that is accepted into the neuron body that generates the reaction within that particular neuron and either passes that on or creates a different structure. Now, what this particular slide is showing is that within a particular sensory neuron, it creates a structure of RNA. And we know what RNA is because we know what DNA is. RNA is a particular transmittal portion of DNA. So within each of the sensory neurons, you actually create a protein structure. That protein structure, which is the RNA transmitter, is unique within that neuron. Because it's unique, when it gets passed on, when it's recreated and passed on by that neuron, it generates a particular and specific reaction within the rest of the body. Now, how many possible reactions are that? Well, there are currently known to be 100 to the 270th power individual proteins. Now that's 100 followed by 270 zeros at the end of it. Proteins in the individual human body. Each protein can either stand by itself or it can form a chain. When it forms a chain, it can actually grow to a huge, huge number. That number is considered by science as infinity. It is gigantic. So any possible combination can be formed, and those possible combinations will result in a specific neuromuscular or mental reaction. And that's the only thing we know about cognition right now, is that from a neuromuscular perspective, if you give a particular neuron a particular chemical soup for a particular duration, it will respond in one specific way or another. A Nobel Prize was recently given to Dr. Philip Kendall for discovering this and discovering how to manipulate individual neurons to determine that memory does exist and it does exist within a cell, but that does not equal the creation of a new thought. All that is just the structure of what currently exists. So we still are wondering, what is cognition? And without knowing that, how do we teach cognition? How do we teach people to think in a specific way? Well, teaching cognition is that we have to focus on the aspects of what we do know. We may have to teach that the mind and the brain are actually two different things, and that the aspect of neuropsychology helps us determine where and how those two separate areas interact. We have to determine what individual personalities are and how those individual personalities interact with other personalities, and that domain is actually well known. Several scientists, from Freud to Carl Jung to others, have researched this over decades and have tested various processes that enable them to make a determination of what a particular individual's personality general structure looks like and how those general structures react or interface with other individuals of differing structures. We have to teach, not only teach, but learn psychology and philosophy within ourselves and how they interact and how they work. We have to learn expectation theory and how it works in the human. First off, we have to learn how they affect ourselves, and then secondly, we have to immerse ourselves into the target dynamics. Now, what is expectation theory? Expectation theory is that thing that says we will expect certain things to occur, and if they don't occur, we will invent to fill those in. A good example of this are mind teaser type things like seeing on the internet a paragraph with all of the vowels removed. Only consonants are there, yet you can still read it. And the reason you can still read it is because the brain says, oh, there should be an A there, there should be an E or an I there, and it puts it in, whether it's there or not. Conversely, if there is something there that our brains are not used to, our brains will tend to ignore it. There's a wonderful demonstration of that, of a group of students that are passing a basketball around. And it tells you to count the number of passes. So you do that. At the end, it says, did you count 27? And of course you did. That's very easy to do. But then it asks, did you see the man dressed in the gorilla suit moonwalking through the center of the passes? And the answer is 99 times out of 100, no, I didn't see it because I was counting the passes. Imagine what that can be like if you are doing an intelligence analysis and something is staring you there in the face, but because you're not expecting to see it, you ignore it. That's basically what I have. I can take questions now.
Thank you, Doctor. I think that was very insightful, and I think this is an area that a lot of us, certainly myself, has not really been exposed to, and so appreciate the time you took to present that to all of us. We have a couple questions from the audience. First one comes from Jane. She said, what areas do you think are weak? What areas do you think the U.S. education system lacks when it comes to the topics that you mentioned, and how do you think we can strengthen the way we deliver some of the material with the topics that you discussed today in mind?
There are several different areas that we are weak in. Primarily, we are weak in the structure of philosophy. We do not teach philosophy very much in our schools anymore because philosophy is generally looked upon as religion by many organizations. And that's because the most famous philosophers come from various religions or from various structures. You can go back to Aristotle and Plato and get a good basis of that. but you actually have to continue forward into a variety of domains which are generally related to both Christian and other religious structures. Buddhism, Taoism, etc., to really get a good understanding of what philosophy is and how it needs to be addressed. Now, I'm not stating that our students should be doctors of philosophy by the time they reach high school. However, when I look back in the past and I'd look at tests that my father had to take to graduate from high school, the amount of logic and the amount of philosophy that he was asked about in those tests were things that I was never taught in the 1960s and 70s. And he went to school in the 30s. If you look back to that time frame in our history, that's when a lot of our scientific progress initiated. People were much different, much more able to handle things along their own and to address things that were outside of what their current understanding was at that time. Right now, I have students that I teach that don't even know how to form a syllogism, much less understand what a syllogism is, or how to determine whether or not it's valid or invalid, true or false. And I have to train them at that, even up to certain individuals at the master's degree level. And that, to me, is a major failing.
Okay, great. Second question comes from Manny. He asks, how is the military applying some of these learnings to their training of soldiers? And I think would include the intelligence community as a whole as well. I think, in other words, do you believe that there is room to further incorporate some of these lessons and some of the facts that you covered in military training on the battlefield, and how could that how is that being applied to strengthen the United States defenses and intelligence community's capabilities when it comes to understanding?
I can't say as a whole because I do not have the exposure. I do know that I have been getting numerous international requests on the studies that I have done for information on how to do just that, how to retrain military analysts, military intelligence personnel in the areas of cognition and cognitive development. The answer that I give is the same that I gave as far as where the educational system as a whole has been failing. I have several individuals, one from Germany and one from Australia, that I am communicating with that are trying to design a means of teaching psychology and philosophy back into the domain of intelligence analysis. That tells me that people are recognizing it as a need and are trying to address that need in a way that makes sense. The other way of answering that question, I guess, is to take a look at a major study that I did personally following Desert Storm. During Desert Storm, there were a large number of individuals, and there were several various reports that came out asking the question why this occurred, of commanders that would take advanced virtual systems that could only help them in the command and control of their organizations, and were disconnecting them from their command vehicles and throwing them out into the desert and going back to using maps and grease pencils. And the question was why? In the analysis that I performed, it showed some definite relationship to personality as to why certain individuals were capable of using these systems and other people were not. And the reason for that was I normalized to education, to culture, to the experience with computer systems that these different individuals had, and found out that the only real identifier was that individual's personality. And the Army followed that up with a $25 million 5-year study to look into that in more depth. They were definitely interested in that why. So again, it relates back to what we're used to and how we base what we do in a high-stress environment. And there's very few environments that are more high-stress than combat when people are shooting at you, as to what we do. And when you are under high stress, you revert back to that which you are most comfortable with, as opposed to that which can actually help you. I don't know if that answers that question, but that's the best I can do at this point.
Okay. A couple questions, a couple of additional questions just came in. First from Gerard, what value, if any, do you see emotional intelligence? Is there a place for it? If so, where or when? Has it eclipsed intelligent thinking?
I'm sorry, was that emotional intelligence?
Yes.
I definitely see a place for that. I've read several very good books on the application of emotional intelligence. It's going back to the concept of understanding why it is that you do things that you do, why it is that certain things that may not bother one person will bother you severely, and then understanding the basis for that, so that you can use it to assist you in removing the expectations of results and allow you to see those things that are in fact in front of you. One of my favorite quotes from the Sherlock Holmes books is that when you remove all possibilities that do not relate to the facts as you see them, whatever remains must be true no matter how unrealistic it seems. And it's because we base realistic perceptions on our biases. That's where they come from.
Okay. The next question comes from Philip. Philip asks, well, he thanks you for your time, as I think do we all. He asks, when defending a death row inmate, it is imperative that anyone working with a capital defendant become aware of the commonalities of this population. Some of the characteristics they share include developmental risk factors for violence. Could you please suggest, in general, one or two potential mitigating environmental factors that may breed neuropsychological impairment?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that, please? There were some broken up statements.
Sure thing. So the question I think that he's getting to is he would like, if you can, to suggest one or two mitigating environmental factors that may breed neuropsychological impairment.
The one that comes most into mind is psychopathic personalities. Individuals with psychopathic personalities basically do not have the capability of forming appropriate conclusions because they do not have the structure of emotion associated with that. If you feel no emotion about something, if you feel no guilt, no remorse, no pull on your psyche as to what may be right or wrong, that could be a mitigating circumstance in that particular situation. Is it a circumstance that could be rectified, cured, controlled? I don't know. I'm not in that particular domain. There's an excellent book that goes into the psychology of killing and some of the factors that are associated with that, and it is called On Killing. Trying to remember the name of the author. It's Dr. Lieutenant Colonel David. I can't think of his name. I may have it in my list. Yeah, Grossman, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. David Grossman. He puts the psychology of what it means to kill into a very good perspective, both from the perspective of individuals who do it on a criminal basis and those people who do it based on being in the military.
All right, the next question comes from Heather. It's an interesting question. She asks, if cognitive thought is a mitigating factor in the intelligence world when conducting a proper investigation, how can we be sure that any of the current studies are accurate and not biased or influenced by the author? And how do we change this for future intelligence work?
You cannot determine that at this point without knowing the individual involved. That's not a possibility. The best thing that you can do is have multiple sources wherever possible. Now, granted, that's not always possible, particularly in a short-term or very critical situation like we had with the Boston bombings, or in the situations leading up to those things. I found that by having red teams and using red teams to try to examine all possible aspects, or at least the possible aspects that make sense around a particular set of facts, can lead you to a more probabilistic standing. But I do think that understanding the nature and the dynamics of operations research would assist in that domain. That's my own personal hypothesis.
Okay. And finally, one question from David. He asks, what are your thoughts on moral psychology and any potential role it may play in combating terrorism and extremism?
That's a very loaded question. I have my own personal beliefs on what is and is not moral based on my background, my experience, my training. Someone else's is going to be different for the same reason. So whose structure is it that you are going to use? What is moral and right to us may be totally different to a headhunter in the Amazon River Basin. It is definitely different between religions, and I'm not talking between Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, etc., but within the religions themselves. You know, just take a look around at how many different churches there are. That's because individuals view specific aspects differently than others do, and culturally, we look for reasons to accept those beliefs that we have as real by getting reinforcement from others with similar beliefs. So making a determination as to whether a specific report or not was biased, I would say always assume that it's biased. Try to identify what those biases are and then relate how it might change if those biases were looked at in a different way. I mean, that's why we have so many doctors out there writing so many dissertations on the same subjects.
Right. And if I can just squeeze one more question in, because I think it's a question that relates to some of the philosophical topics that you've discussed. This last question is from James, and he asks, how does Stoic philosophy relate to the education of military and intelligence personnel?
Okay, would you repeat that one more time, please?
Sure. How does Stoic philosophy relate to the education of military and intelligence personnel?
Stoic philosophy relates in the same way that Mem's philosophy and Aristotelian philosophy and Thomas Aquinas' philosophy does. It's a tool. It is not something that is in and of itself totally right or totally wrong. Again, because it was designed to develop by an individual who had themselves specific biases, concerns, cultural entities that they were raised in, and even the knowledge of the time that they had. if you look at Plato and Aristotle and Aquinas, their philosophies are very deep, very, very good, yet they could not consider things such as localization or non-localization. They could not take a look at some of the new understandings of quantum physics and how quantum physics relate, because we are all, every one of us, are made up of atoms, and those atoms are made up of quanta, and those quanta create certain situations that we have to respond to. We have no choice. It's the laws of physics. The more we understand those things, the more we understand how they might influence us. But if an individual is stating that Stoic philosophy is the best way to go, maybe it is for them. Doesn't mean it is for everybody. As an ORSA, I use multiples and techniques to come to an understanding of what the data shows. But even with that, I can only look at a couple of variables at a time, because to do anything beyond that delves into chaos. And you don't know when you change item A how it relates to item Z. There may be any number of other things that have to exist in a certain order for that to affect it. And the same is true with any type of tool set that you would use within the structure of looking at analysis. Semiotics is a good example of that. Semiotics structures that words mean things, and therefore you have to establish what those words mean within the environment and the structure that you're working in. Does that mean semiotics is the only way to go? I know people that are pushing semiotics as being a replacement for the scientific method because the scientific method is wrong. Well, excuse me, but the scientific method is not wrong, it's just different. There was a statement that was made many years ago by a very smart individual talking about modeling and simulation. He said, all models are wrong, some are useful.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Nyman, for hosting this webinar today. I think it was very valuable, and I think, judging by the detailed questions we had, certainly a lot of interested listeners on the phone. So at this point, we will be ending the webinar, but I just wanted to remind everyone that you may find a recording of the presentation on our website, henleyputnam.edu, in the security briefing section of the student resources menu at the top of the homepage. And we look forward to having everyone back for our next webinar, so stay tuned for more information about that. If you would like more information about Henley-Putnam in general, just click the link in the webinar email that you all received and request information on the website on the top right-hand side. We look forward to hearing you or to having you back on another webinar, and I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you very much.